Whoops. Hey folks, today I'm going to be giving you an introduction into getting started with mobile development in Unity. It's a pretty straightforward process. We're going to be covering a bunch of different topics. This is a quick summary of what we're going to be doing. First we're going to go through the process of setting up your workspace for Android under the build settings. We're going to talk about Text Mesh Pro and getting your on-screen buttons working. The kind of anchoring settings and scaling things appropriately, and then exporting your build. So let's kind of jump right in. So if you go under File and Build Settings, most of you, I assume, will have gone to this window before. And if you look on the platform window here, you can see that there's the option of Android here. So what you will do, I'm gonna kind of join in the process. So if I just go into, that's not what I wanted to do. If we go into Unity, if we go to build settings, go to Android, and then switch platform. It'll take a little bit of time just compiling the scripts and kind of changing over. And yeah, once you've done that, you'll then get a kind of a bunch of extra options available, which is relatively straightforward. The one thing that I find really useful, which we'll kind of go into a little bit later in terms of a more sophisticated tool, but you get a bunch of, unlike the standard version where you just get your kind of basic aspect ratios, with the kind of build settings for Android, you get a bunch of different aspect ratios for different devices and different resolutions, which is quite handy. If we just give this a quick second, this should be nearly done. I suppose I can go through the presentation in the meantime. You can see these different resolutions and aspect ratios here. Which when you're just getting started are kind of useful to have rather than just using free aspect. I would recommend at this point to pick one of these. This is dependent on your own project, but quite a lot of hyper-casual games use portrait as the default. So I usually kind of set it to portrait as a default in terms of picking an early screen size. And also potentially as well, think about maybe going for some of the smaller settings, because you can always scale these things up as you go. It's kind of harder to design around scaling stuff down the other way. So this is kind of the format that I like to try and arrange myself for when I'm working with, portrait games. So you've got the preview of the game, so you can kind of preview how it looks, on the device format. And then you kind of standard hierarchy and inspector around that. A couple of things to think about when you're kind of importing your assets, depending on what you're doing, to think about how your assets are being imported. Quite a few of you have expressed interest in doing kind of pixel art or kind of retro games for your hyper-casual projects. One common problem, which always looks gross in student projects, is to not not change the filter setting for your sprites when you import them. So if you go to the filter mode and you change it from what's happened there? Oh, there we go. Just hit the scroll wheel. If you just change the filter mode to point rather than bilinear or trilinear, it'll just sharpen up your assets. If you've got any of these weird artifacts here like this, what you can actually do is you can just turn off compression, and that'll keep your assets relatively clean. You don't need to worry about compression if you're dealing with like tiny assets that are like pixels big. It's only when you're getting to bigger scale objects that becomes a problem. Some other things to think about is try to have like a decent folder structure for your project from the offset. Remember that there are marks available for having a good folder structure. I'll be trying to kind of reinforce this as we go throughout the module, but getting this thing figured out early, really pays off in the long run, rather than trying to retroactively like figure out where your stuff is for your project. One thing that a lot of people don't think about, or spend very little time with student wise, is like experimenting with the field of view, and kind of just in general experimenting with the camera within Unity. So you know, if I just quickly set this to portrait mode, you know, for one, the very basic thing that I would expect is for you to change the background color. You know, set it to anything else, just not that horrible blue. Um, just because, yeah, it's the easiest way to tell that you're an amateur um, in terms of your project. So just set it to anything else, just please. uh, yeah, just so I know you actually care about color theory, or just any kind of level of professionalism. Um, so I can clear that. So yeah, like thing you might want to think about on top of that when it comes to your camera is thinking about like the kind of field of view for your project. So you know, rather than just um, you know, leaving it as standard, you know, see if having, you know, adjusting the field of view uh, is beneficial to your project. Obviously, quite a few of you are going to be working in 2D. Um, some of you, you know, some of you that might not be an issue, but the number of student projects that I see where like you can see that they've just left it as the default camera state, um, and it just seems really unprofessional. You know, look at things like maybe slightly offsetting the camera to give like almost like a 2.5D effect. Maybe look at having perspective mode rather than orthographic. Maybe look at doing isometric. Don't just leave like side view as the default. And yeah, if you have any questions about that, talk to me. You know, if you're worried that it's gonna, you know, deviate too much from a 2D to a 3D game. Um, and yeah, mess around with the clipping planes because they can sometimes be a problem if you're kind of working with assets quite up close. Yeah, so yeah, if I just nip back to the presentation, um, I think that's everything for this section here. If we just nip on to the next slide, the next thing that I'm gonna, you know, suggest that you start with is creating a basic button. So when it comes to kind of creating basic buttons for your project, there's two main methods of creating buttons, which is the kind of the standard Unity tools, and then there's Mesh Pro. It's kind of frustrating that Unity has this kind of, because of its legacy and you know how long it's been in development, you've got all these like splinterings of systems and tools where you have like duplicates of everything. Yeah, and it just makes everything really fiddly to operate. But yeah, using Mesh Pro, I would recommend over the alternative. There's a lot more options and adjustments you can make to it, and a lot more customization than you know, the original text tools and button tools. So if I snip into Unity, so what you will need to do though is if you do want to create UI elements, which obviously, you know, I'm encouraging you to do, is you'll need to import the actual tools themselves. So if I create a button, you'll get this pop-up which kind of asks you if you want to import the TMP Essentials, which is Mesh Pro. So you want to do that. Well, it's not going to take long. It'll take a couple of seconds. And yeah, that'll kind of give you everything that you need to kind of get started. You'll see that when you actually create a button, it also creates a canvas. So the canvas is kind of what, if you look here in the scene view instead of the game view. In fact, let me split this now. Let me get rid of the assets store because I hate clicking on that. Nice. Yeah, you can see the canvas there. That's kind of what is going to be visible in game and like where your assets are placed in relation to it. So if I, move this around here, that's what's in the field of view. Something else to think about as part of this is, which for some bizarre reason, Unity has like a completely different scale for its canvases versus stuff in game, which can be quite frustrating, where like you end up with, depending if you have things like overlays or big UI components, you can end up like blocking whole swathes of your scene with the canvas components. So you can toggle those off and hide them if they're causing you grief. But yeah, rather than kind of moving this around by hand and manually placing it, one thing that I would recommend is to use the anchoring tools. So let me just hop back onto the presentation, because there is actually sections on this. Yeah, so the first thing that you kind of want to keep in mind for the module is that I don't expect to see any of these basic buttons when it comes to your projects, when it comes to the final submission. Like I'll be going over it in next week's lecture, but the UI is the first thing that you see in game, and it's really common for projects to just have these basic buttons in, and it just reeks of amateur hour. It's really an immediate signal to an employer that you aren't considering the customer experience, and it's really easy to change these things. It's kind of one of the reasons why it's unforgivable, arguably. They're very customizable. You can change all the elements about them. You can change the font, you can change the color, the scale, even the bevel, or the effect on the buttons. And then if you hate the buttons, which I do, you can change them out for your own sprites and import custom graphics. If I just hop back into Unity, I can, if I click on the button itself, I can change it here from, the transition mode from color tint to sprite swap, or even get an animation in, if you want to do something a little bit more sophisticated. So yeah, like, and with those you've got all the different sections for like overlap and clicked and disabled, stuff like that. And even just in the basic settings, you can kind of change all of these functions. So if I wanted to make this is not great for complementary colors, but let's give that a quick test. Should now have a button that I can hover over and it changes the color. Yeah, so it doesn't really take that much to do that. And what you can also do, which is nice, is you can experiment with things like the opacity. So when you click on it, it like, and depending on what kind of game you're building, you'll want to factor that kind of stuff in. If you're building like an arcadey style game, you'll maybe want it to be quite flashy transitions for your buttons. If you're building like a kind of a minimalist chill experience, you probably want like opacity, transitions for your buttons. These are all things to think about. And then you can click on the little subsection here and you can change the text as well. You can change all the elements about it. You can even hide that stuff if you're just wanting it to be symbols. And change the font. Like there's so much that you can adjust. It's just kind of unexcusable. Just leaving these things by default. So in terms of actually changing the dimensions of the buttons themselves, you can do it within this menu here. I'm just going to make this a little bit bigger. And then on top of that, if I just make that probably 90, yeah, that's great. You can also alter the anchors. So if I just, and just a reminder that if you do have these default buttons in, you're going to get penalized like heavily in the mark scheme for having these default buttons in. So please don't leave them as they are. But continuing on, for your actual setup for your buttons, this anchor view basically allows you to kind of adjust the placement of those buttons on the screen based on, like, what corner of the device you want it to scale to. So if you're dealing with iPhone 12S's or whatever the hell they're called, the new ones, and you've got a ridiculously long screen, you won't want those elements to sit in the middle of the screen. You want them to adjust. And then on top of that as well, you've got the kind of stretch elements. So if you've got buttons that you want to scale to bigger devices, it can factor in those things too. Yeah, so if I kind of go back into the game itself, if I click on this here, the anchor presets view, I can change this, and it will adjust the anchor point. So if I, for example, tied it to there, and then I adjusted this to some ridiculously high resolution, you can see that it ties to there. If I adjust it to here, I need to bring that back down. That's not even on the screen anymore. Whoops. Let me adjust that back, and then do that again. You'll see now that it scales appropriately, or to where it needs to be on the screen. You'll notice as well, though, is that it's quite tiny on the screen. If I move this button, just to clarify, I'll just go back to what I had before. Ooh, not that. If I move this button somewhere else, that alignment might not be satisfactory for, it might be slightly off from the center, and it's just not generally aligned to where it needs to be. One nice shortcut is that you can use Control and Alt, Shift and Alt, to kind of set the alignment and anchor it in one move, which is really useful. And then on top of that as well, you can kind of set the stretch limits. This one, for example, will scale it based on the height of the screen, which has some limitations. And this one sets it on the width. So yeah, you can kind of use those to make your assets scale based on the size of the device. Another way to do that, and also you might want to, once you've got that alignment there, you can just nudge that up a little bit to not be on the edge of the screen. Another thing to factor in is, and this is quite an important one, that you'll get docked marks for as well if you don't adjust, is how you get your UI to scale. So if you look on the canvas scaler, you can see that there's a thing called UI scale mode. So by default, for some reason, it's set to constant pixel size. What you want is to scale with screen size. And you'll see immediately that kind of adjusts the size of the button itself. And depending on whether your game is portrait or landscape, you'll either want it to be width or height. So I believe, don't quote me on this, that for portrait, let me see actually. You would want it to be height. Yep. Because the one thing to keep in mind is your game should never go from landscape to portrait. So, yeah, height will adjust your UI proportionally. Yep. And then if you're dealing with landscape, you'd set it to width. And then that way, based on the width of the device, your UI will scale. Obviously, if you left it as width, you can see as the device gets taller, the button stays the same. So yeah, have a mess around with those and kind of, because it is a gradient, so you can kind of dictate between where you want it to sit. But this is like a critical thing. If you don't set this up, then your UI will be like missing off the top and bottom of the screen. And in last year's assignments, there was a ridiculous number of people that didn't bother doing this step. So make sure you don't miss this. Yeah, so let's nip back to this. Yeah, that's still a little bit of extra info about how to kind of set up your sprite swap. So if you import like an image with, you can use the sprite tools to kind of subdivide that up. You can then kind of set those images as different animations. If you have any kind of further questions about, you can ask that about me about it in class. Yeah. So from here, you've got this kind of very basic button, and I will emphasize this is a very, this should just be used to kind of, for initial prototyping. This function shouldn't be used as like your main functionality for the game. It is very, very basic in its functionality. But for now, if you want to get something working for your game that isn't that isn't just you using arrow keys, you can tie functions to these buttons. So you create a script. In the case of me, I've got this basic debug script that's checking if the character's jumping. And then attach that to whatever object you have ID'd as the player. And then if I kind of hop back into Unity, let me just quickly check something. Yeah, it's recording for you. Yeah, if I just quickly attach this to our player, which is this very nice cube. Let's make sure it's attached. Yep. What I can do now, which is quite neat, is I can go into this button. I can scroll down to this on-click function. I can click add to list, and then I can define an object to find in the scene. So if I go to my cube and then search in its functions, I can grab that jump function. So then when I click play and I check the console, I've got a bunch of messages saying that the actor is jumping. So yeah, you can see how this could be, like, very quickly you could get a you could get a set of controls for your project. Yeah. So as I said before, just to kind of reinforce this again, this is kind of like for just starting out, like this week. Obviously, we'll talk about this when I'm talking to you about your projects, but this isn't going to be necessarily an absolute Hail Mary for your projects. You may need to build your own buttons and functionality, but this is a good starting point. So from here, there's the actual process of exporting the build. To get your game on a device is surprisingly straightforward. Obviously, when we delve into iOS, it's an absolute fever dream, nightmare. But for Android, it's very easy. It's literally just, at the minimum, the simplest way of doing it is to build out a project. So you just do build, and it'll cough out an APK, and basically just load that onto your device. So the way I usually do it is I'll export an APK, and then I'll just use Bluetooth from my laptop to send it over to the device, and then just manually load it on from there. If I have problems with connections, there's a bunch of documentation that's available on how to kind of get your device, if you have one, to connect up with Unity. I would, if you do have access to a device, that's great. Obviously, for the purposes of the module, it's not necessary. but if you do have a device to test on, I would strongly recommend it. What you will need to do as part of that is to enable developer controls. It can vary between different devices, but you basically need to kind of enable debugging for your device. And to do that, usually you go to like the settings menu and you like tap like 12 times and click your heels together 3 times and say there's no place like home or all that stuff. Um, and it'll give you the options for developer tools to unlock. So have a nosy online on how to do that for your individual device. There's a bunch of like um, bizarre ways of unlocking those functions. Um, yeah, and then from there, once you've got all that stuff set up, when you have your device connected to your machine, it should display it here. And if it does do that, you can build it out and run it simultaneously, and it'll display your device. One of the students also mentioned an app. I can't remember what the heck its name is for the life of me. I should have made a note of it. But it's called something like it's called like Unity 3 or something like that. It's an app basically which allows you to visualize the game on. Actually, it might have mentioned in the next slides. Nope. Yeah, basically, it's an app that allows you to display the game on a device, kind of directly, almost like streamed to the device, which is handy. The only thing you need to keep in mind with that is that it's just a stream of your game, and that it's not using the actual processor of the device, so it might not actually reflect how the game will perform without Unity to support it. I'll put it in the comments what the name of the actual app is that you can kind of connect to with that. Apologies that I don't have it to hand. So in terms of things to actually export it out to, so for the purposes of this module, at the end of the assignment, you will export your game as an APK, and you will test it in Android Studio for to make sure it runs reliably on a bunch of different devices. This has been installed in the university labs, but I've been told by the tech staff that you need to choose a specific machine to install your SDKs on, and then stick with it. Otherwise, you'll have to keep installing it as you go around. And yeah, this is good. This is kind of how traditionally a lot of developers have kind of got around this, and if they've not had access to devices. However, in the new version of Android Studio, basically, like there is this new function in the latest versions of Unity. So this is basically the device simulator, and this is basically just a package that you install, and it gives you a ton of different kind of devices that you can test on real time in Unity. So if we hop back into Unity right now, I've actually got this installed already. It's pretty straightforward to access. You just go to the package manager, package manager, advanced, and you add show preview packages, and then scroll down to device simulator. Get that installed. You'll need anything past 2019.3 to be able to install it. The tutorial here goes through it as well if you want to kind of have a video to go through. From the folks I've spoken to about it, it's pretty ace, and basically makes Android Studio for the purposes of this redundant. You can do stuff like rotation to see how it performs. It actually, takes input, so you can properly kind of play test stuff. You've got like a bazillion, well, not a bazillion, but you've got like a bunch of different devices that you can visualize it on. Obviously, again, keep in mind that like this needs to be able to run on these devices, and this may not necessarily simulate the performance of these devices. I will need to verify that if that's the case. A lot of these devices listed here are kind of relatively modern ones. So obviously mileage may vary on how reliable these are. But yeah, from what I've experienced and kind of dabbled with them so far, it seems like a pretty good for kind of getting your UI set up and kind of adjusting stuff in real time and seeing how the simulator adjusts. Yeah, so what I would want you to do in kind of the next week is try to get your UI set up, or try to get kind of your game functioning on a device. What I mean by a UI is like some basic buttons on the screen to kind of like get your, whatever object you have in your game, like whether it's a character or some kind of interaction that you have in your game controlled by buttons rather than by key presses. We'll get into UI stuff next week and UX. One thing to be thinking about is I'm kind of setting as a target on the week 6. I want you to be aiming to have something to play test and for us to kind of like share between the other members of the course. And I'll be going around and testing individually each of your games and giving you a bunch of feedback. Use this as a target to arguably get your game as a complete state as possible. Remember that from the start I discussed this as choose a game in scope that you can build in a week. This is what this is about. Get a game that is pretty functional, and then from here we can kind of iterate the actual process. A reminder that please do not have any default buttons when you show me your project. And yeah, if you can, try to get access to a device. Obviously, it's difficult given the current circumstances. But see if people on Discord are willing to test as well. I'm sure there'll be lots of enthusiastic testers out there, especially if you have accompany it with some kind of neat GIF of the game itself. Yeah, that's kind of basically everything for now. Have fun kind of getting your stuff working in Unity. And yeah, if you manage to get your game working on a device, post up about it in the Discord. And if you have any questions, just let me know. Cool.